Thank you again for joining us today for Chinese Americans in Classic Hollywood, Anime Wong, Tyrus Wong, and the Chinatown extras who made movie magic. As a part of SAPAAC's Asian Pacific American Alumni Heritage Month, we are hosting this event, and I just want to tell you a little bit about SAPAAC, which is the Stanford Asian Pacific American Alumni Club. It's one of Stanford University's largest alumni organizations. We are dedicated to connecting Asian American and Pacific Islander alumni to the university and to each other. So it's free to join if you're a Stanford alumni. And what do you get by becoming a member? Membership empowers you to attend numerous events in your region, engage with a thriving alumni community, and receive the latest communications about our alma mater from an AAPI perspective. And we do send out a monthly newsletter, which you will get as soon as you join. So if you haven't joined already, we're going to post some instructions in the chat. You basically go to the groups.stanford.edu platform and click join on the SAPAAC page. Very easy and painless process. So I hope you will all join us if you haven't already. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the evening. Jeff Yang is a writer, journalist, producer, and screenwriter, and the author of The Golden Screen, The Movies That Made Asian America. He's also co-author of the New York Times bestselling Rise, A Pop History of Asian America from the 90s to now, as well as the Once Upon a Time in China and I Am Jackie Chan, My Life in Action, the action icon's autobiography. He's currently working with Academy Award nominated director Renee Tajima Pena and the Center for Asian American Media to develop The Golden Screen as a 5-part PBS documentary. Without further ado, I give you Jeff Yang.
Thank you, Katie. It is my pleasure and honor to be here amongst a stellar panel and all of you who have chosen to join us on this this lovely afternoon. It is my pleasure also to introduce our panelists, including Katie. So we're kind of log rolling here a little bit, but I'll begin with Karen Fang, who is a film scholar and cultural critic who writes and speaks for museums and film festivals around the world. Specialist on the intersection of Eastern and Western aesthetics. She has also written on the interplay between Hong Kong and Hollywood cinema, a great topic of fascination for myself as well. As well as 19th century British writing about exotic artifacts, legacies of Aldous Huxley and George Orwell in contemporary Chinese fiction. She is a regular contributor to the long-running public radio series, The Engines of Our Ingenuity, in which Karen's stories always focus on the visual arts. Welcome, Karen. Also with us, we have Will Gao, a Sacramento-based community historian, educator, and documentary filmmaker. A fourth-generation Chinese American, he served as a volunteer historian with the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California for over 20 years. At CHSSC, he co-directs the Five Chinatowns Project, documenting the history of the various Chinatowns that existed in Los Angeles between 1875 and 1965. He's currently at CSU Sacramento as an assistant professor of Asian American Studies in the Ethnic Studies Department. Welcome, Will. And she needs no introduction, but I shall anyway. Katie Gee Salisbury is the author of Not Your China Doll, a new biography of Anime Wong, Hollywood's first Asian American movie star. Her writing and photography has appeared in the New York Times, MSNBC, Vanity Fair, The Ringer, The Believer, the Asian American Writers Workshop, and elsewhere. She gave the TED Talk, As American as Chop Suey, and also writes the brilliant newsletter, brilliant is my editorializing, Half-Caste Woman. A fifth-generation Chinese American who hails from Southern California, she now lives in my old hometown of Brooklyn. Welcome, Katie. So thank you guys all, and thank you, Katie, for assembling this, again, stellar panel. It is really tremendous to see people delving into the history of our representation in the visual arts and media and entertainment. It's something where frequently I think most people who even pay attention to issues of representation tend to think that Asian American cinema sort of began with Joy Luck Club and then sort of, you know, took a 20-year leap into Crazy Rich Asians. And the fact is, we have a lot of history. In fact, arguably, we were part of the founding of Hollywood's own history, and the works that each of you guys have done really, I think, address that very topic from different directions. So I wanted to begin by asking you to talk a little bit about each of your books and to explain more what drew you to the subject you chose to work on. And let me actually begin with Karen, and then we'll go to Will and then Katie.
Yeah, so for background artists, to me, Tyrus and Wong's story is, as I say, as a sort of log line. It's how the true story of how an illegal immigrant shaped so much of America's best loved and most recognized imagery, and what it tells us about the unifying and uplifting power of art. And so, a lot of people in recent years have learned about Tyrus's relationship to Bambi, which we could talk about, which in itself is a story. To think that this iconic, globally recognized, beloved film was arguably only possible because a Chinese immigrant who could not yet be a citizen at that time helped save this project that was just foundering. But that's actually only a small part of his story. In addition to that, he worked for nearly 30 years at Warner Brothers. To me, one of the most interesting things was that he was, for 20 years, one of America's most recognized greeting card artists. He was a prominent fine artist before his move to commercial arts. And then, of course, he has, what you see in the film, this wonderful long retirement, making these kites to fly in Santa Monica Beach. And then he lived to 106 years. So, anyone who lives to 106 years has seen a lot, and you have a lot to learn from. And so, I wanted to be able to tell this entire story, the story of this art that moves through so many media, and art as a way of writing back against invisibility and non-citizenship.
That is brilliant. And I think anybody who actually has watched Bambi and seen the lush backgrounds, the incredible animation, knows that somebody, yes, such as yours, with stellar
Which is
talent.
not Disney, I have to say. This is not Disney news. This is Tyrus art. So.
Lush, again, nevertheless, and not trademarked or copyrighted in any way. But it was evident that Bambi was more than a work of cinematic art, but a truly a work of visual splendor. It's quite interesting that you titled the book "Background Artist" because Will, actually, the work that you've done has focused on, well, background artists. So tell us a little bit more about the research and the book you've written.
Yeah, so my forthcoming book comes out next week. Performing Chinatown looks at the way in which Chinese Americans in Los Angeles use performance, both for tourists in Chinatown and as background and bit players in Hollywood film, to shape ideas of what it meant to be Chinese American in the kind of popular consciousness. I think one of the things that's really most interesting to note is how widespread extra work was for Chinese Americans in LA, right? So, for example, Tyrus Wong was an extra. Nearly everybody in Chinatown was an extra. Chinatown in 1930 had roughly 3,000 people in it. So super, super small, right? In 1930, LA's population is like 1.2 million. So only 3,000 Chinese Americans. And yet at this moment in time, because of kind of global events, the Japanese go into Manchuria, and then eventually the Sino-Japanese War breaks out, World War II. Because of this increased interest, Hollywood takes a profound interest in making movies about China. Now, in the foreground of most of those films, they put white actors in yellowface, right? But in the background, they employ many, many hundreds and hundreds of Chinese American background players, right? So if we believe the claim of one film, The Good Earth claims to have hired 1,000 Chinese Americans. Now, if there were 3,000 Chinese Americans in Los Angeles, that means The Good Earth hired 1/3 of all of the Chinese Americans just in one film. And even if they overestimated by half, they still hired 1/6 of all of the Chinese Americans, right? So the point being that Chinese Americans are everywhere in Hollywood in this moment, and so it's an exciting time to kind of to discuss and kind of analyze.
Even that mathematical leap is mind-boggling. But the other thing is that this is something which, when we're talking about, obviously, your book, Katie, is quite apparent. Background artists, background extras, as it were Chinese because they were non-speaking and kind of moving in the background. And so hiring cheap you know, relatively cheap labor to be essentially human decor is one thing. But if you're actually talking about Chinese American artists playing Chinese American people at the center of the screen, the number of Chinese who were actually allowed to occupy that space diminished rapidly. And the number of people who played those roles who were not Chinese, but, you know, had a coat of paint applied to their features was far greater, which of course is a central theme in your book, Katie. So tell us a little more about Not Your China Doll.
Yeah, well, so I will say that Will and I have bonded over our obsession with the good earth. And I actually drew a lot from his research with oral histories and things like that for the portion that I wrote about it in my book about Anna May Wong. And that's the great irony, right? That it was this huge boon to the Chinese American community in that sense. It gave all these jobs. They were suddenly visible. It was a sympathetic story about the Chinese. But of course, there didn't end up being a role for Anna May Wong in it. So I first learned about Anna May Wong as a Stanford student. I was doing my first college internship at the Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles. And on my first day there, I was taken on a tour of the exhibitions. And there was a photograph of Anna May Wong, and I didn't know who she was. But for whatever reason, I immediately saw her and said, I need to know who this woman is. And once it was explained to me that she was this internationally famous Chinese American movie star from the 1920s, you know, I was just totally shocked that someone like her could have existed in that era. And then nobody had told me about her. And when I went home and asked my mom, she didn't really know that much about her, or just thought her name sounded familiar. And everyone I talked to seemed to have forgotten her. So this project, this desire to write about her, is really kind of come to fruition after 20 years since that initial moment. But it started also from a place of feeling the injustice that such an important figure in Hollywood history could be so thoroughly forgotten. And so my book really talks a lot about the challenges that she encountered, but not only the challenges, but the way in which she was constantly resilient and picking herself back up and came back with new ideas and new ways to kind of work through a very racist system that was not, you know, made for someone like her. So I'm very excited to talk with, you know, both Karen and Will today, because there's so much overlap in the themes that we talk about in each of our books. And they were all, you know, we're talking about similar eras of Hollywood.
I do absolutely encourage you guys to comment on each other and to follow on. But I think, Katie, you're absolutely right. This era of Hollywood was so deeply interwoven in ways that I think a lot of us didn't even know about. I mean, many of us didn't even know about this era of Hollywood to begin with, that it existed, that there were Chinese in it, that, you know, but I think in reading your book and also reading some of your research, Will, it became apparent that the Chinese community on screen and the Chinese community of Los Angeles, the actual physical Chinatown of Los Angeles, were deeply interconnected. I think it's true not just for Anna May Wong and obviously for many of the people who kind of crossed the line between being Chinese on screen and being Chinese on the streets, as it were. But I believe even, you know, people like Tyrus Wong and so forth, there was so much more of a desire among the few Chinese who were present in Los Angeles at the time, relatively speaking, to be a part of this you know, community that was their cultural hub. It's just quite a different world back then. And a big reason for that simply is that this was an era of exclusion, an era where for Chinese in America, those who were here, arriving itself was already just incredibly challenging. But finding ways to sustain, to preserve your cultural identity, to preserve the you know, the language and the relationships that you had known historically, both with people abroad and the people you brought with, was just so much harder in that time. I wanted to ask you guys a little bit more about how the legal ramifications of exclusion really impacted the lives of the people you wrote about. And because you had actually, in fact, mentioned it, Karen, I want to start with you and Tyrus.
Yeah, so Tyrus came in under exclusion. He came in 1920, at the very end of 1920, and he was held as a child at Angel Island for a month. And because of the circumstances in which children had to stay with their mothers, but mothers, the women and children were very rarely allowed to be there. So he remembers being the only child in Angel Island at the time for the month that he was there. And he was only, it's not clear exactly what his actual biological age was, because again, the documents that survive are an acquired identity. So he was probably about 9 or 10 years old. So can you imagine? I'm a mother. I can't imagine having a child 9 or 10 years old for a month, in this sort of, a holding cell, under a language that he doesn't understand, right? And then at the end of that month, to have to regurgitate this acquired information that he had mastered, just by rote memorization in order to pass an entry exam. But he does, and so that enables him to then enter the US. And I talk a lot in the book about the sort of significance of the name that he chooses to use, which is a combination of his paper name and his family name. And the significance of a name as an artist when you're writing your name. But I wanted to just sort of speak generally, to a point that Jeff, you're making about sort of the significance of these artists in cinema, and these questions of representation. Because, I think a lot of times, when we think about these different eras of invisibility and invisibility of Asians on screen, when we look at today with everything all at once and all the way back to the golden age, right, we kind of see that as the same problem of, the big studios don't want to, they put the white people in front, as Will pointed out, which is true. But, in the golden age, when you're still in the era of exclusion, the capacity for representation is doubly important, because it's not just simply appearing in popular culture, which is, still important, but you're using popular culture to appear in the face of a legal system that does not allow you to represent yourself. And so the sort of triumph of these cinema workers, in the golden age is particularly impactful, not only because it was early, but because it's a substitution, a proxy, a surrogate for something else.
Yeah, I want to build on Karen's point here. I think one of the parts of my book that I think is most interesting is that I look at the ways in which Chinese American merchants are using Chinatown itself as a site to kind of challenge dominant concepts of what it means to be Chinese American during the exclusion era, right? Today, oftentimes people will be like, oh, if you go to San Francisco Chinatown, that's all fake, right? And I think the idea that when people look at, like, they've heard the fact that, San Francisco Chinatown after the earthquake was rebuilt by, white architects, where they look at Los Angeles Chinatown and they see all these pagoda roofs and they kind of dismiss it. And that's really the wrong way to look at it, because it's looking at it ahistorically, right? When you approach Chinatown as a kind of historical object, and you think about the way in which Chinatown really was in many ways an object that or a community, a place that came up as a result of exclusion. And it was a representation, a conscious representation to the outside world of how folks wanted to be represented, right? We have to keep in mind that the dominant representation in the, from the late 18th century to the mid 20th century of Chinese Americans was of a yellow peril, right? So white folks represented Chinese Americans as being a threat to white jobs, as a threat to the white patriarchal family. They were seen as just being like outside of the kind of general types of normative domestic ideas that white folks kind of like embraced. And so what did Chinese Americans do? They produced a type of like Chinese American environment in Chinatown that white people felt comfortable in. And so when you think of things like chop suey, when you think about things like fortune cookies, when you think about things like pagoda roofs, it's totally wrong to think about those things as being inauthentic. Rather, you should see them as being authentic representations of Chinese America during the exclusion era, right? They're fundamentally, profoundly Chinese American because they're a result of pushing back against Chinese exclusion era representations.
It took a lot, actually, for me to get my arms around this notion that Chinese American culture was an accommodation, right? That so many of the things we think of as inauthentic, to your point, were actually adaptive camouflage, a means of actually taking the things that perhaps would have been a little bit too startling, a little too, in your face Chinese, and adapting them to the palettes, the visual and taste and aesthetic palettes of, well, Americans who are fascinated by things that were exotic, but not too exotic, right? which I think brings us to Anime Wong. I think your book does a fantastic job of giving her such a deep interior life in ways that I think you could not tell from looking at her on screen. But one of the things that I thought was most powerful about Not Your China Doll was kind of lensing her as both this glamorous screen star, but also the daughter of immigrants who still lived and worked in the laundry that her immigrant parents operated, alongside her siblings, coming home from the studio to essentially roll up her sleeves, and that reality of life, even for people who are legally in this in America, as it were. Um, you know, very few Chinese came to America and were white collar professionals who went to schools like Stanford or Harvard. They were working class people. So, Katie, yeah, let's talk a little more about, again, the context of being immigrant and how it shaped Anna's career, but also Anime's perception by others.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so Anime Wong was born in Los Angeles, and her parents were actually both born in California. So it was actually her grandparents who would have
So she's
immigrated.
third generation, yeah.
Third generation. I mean, it's hard to imagine someone being third generation Chinese American when they're born in 1905. But that was true for her, and then that was part of what was so unusual about her, is because people didn't know what that was, right? To be both Chinese and American. And so there were a lot of projected assumptions onto her. You know, you read so many of her early interviews are about how she's this beautiful, she looks like something, a China doll out of a storybook, out of a Yuan dynasty poem, and then she opens her mouth and she's speaking like a flapper, like all the other young women, and they don't know what to do with her. And throughout her career, she kind of, through these experiences, is kind of radicalized, I think, against the racism that she experiences, because from her perspective, she just feels as though she's an American, right? She's like any other girl. But then when certain things happen to her, and speaking of exclusion, I don't think she totally understood how much the law controlled her movements, right, as within this country, until a particular film she was working on, the Alaskan. It was supposed to be set in Alaska, but Hollywood, to save some money, they just thought, well, we'll just go to Canada and film it there. So she travels with the crew. James Wong Howe, also a famous Chinese American cinematographer, is working on this film. So together, they're the two Chinese people in this crew. And as they're about to cross the border from Washington into Canada, everyone suddenly realizes that they don't have the appropriate papers to leave the country, and they might not be let back in. And this actually came out in an interview with one of the other cast members, who talks about how it was like, oh, there was all this rigmarole about this thing, and then suddenly it was fixed. So we don't actually know how it was fixed. Apparently, probably the studio paid somebody off, right? So they could go to Canada and they could come back, and there weren't going to be any issues. But that's Anime Wong's first brush with this, the seriousness of her status, or lack of status, as a Chinese American. And so she gets her certificate of identity. And then when she gets back to Los Angeles, she takes all of her siblings to Mexico, so that they can establish their status as Americans. And actually, kicking it back to Karen, I mean, in her book, she talks about, there's a really kind of dramatic episode where Tyrus goes through a similar thing, but it doesn't pan out in his favor, at least not initially. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, Karen.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of thing happens. I mean, this is a century-old problem. I also mentioned in my book that it happened to the comedian Jimmy O. Yang, like after 2000, where this, where a college kid crosses the border to Tijuana, like not thinking it's going to happen. But in Tyrus's case, he'd been in the U.S. for 10 years. He was an art student, and he was well liked and everything. And so he just thinks, I'm going to go sketching. Not even thinking he's crossing the border. But of course, at the time, you were supposed to register your movement if you were, as a Chinese, if you planned to leave the US and come back. He wasn't carrying his alien registration papers, which Chinese were required to carry at all times. And so he goes across for this sketching trip and then is unable to come back. And he suddenly finds himself, almost in the same situation that he was in 10 years ago of, uncertain of whether he's going to enter again. And so, and actually, to Katie's point about James Wong Howe, who, along with Anna May Wong, they were sort of the two most powerful Chinese Americans or ethnic Asians in Hollywood at the time, even larger category. James Wong Howe at that time was very, very influential and was often able to move to foreign locations because he was so important to the studios. But later, during the McCarthy era, he undergoes a series of problems because of the anti-communist xenophobia during the time. And so his career is really suffers later on because of, at that time, the sort of ambiguity of his citizenship.
You know, I was going to ask actually about James Wong Howe because James Wong Howe obviously and Anna May Wong were close friends in addition to collaborators. I've seen in some places that they were actually related, like blood related in some fashion.
That was just like a line that got into, press pieces that they thought,
Right.
oh, they're related. Like every Wong is related.
Two Wongs must be right. Exactly. But either way, they were again part of this like Chinatown nexus, right? They would have parties together, invite people to celebrate Lunar New Year, etc. And because they were kind of the they were the individuals who, to your point, Karen, were amongst the most influential and powerful of a very small and select set of people. But they also, I think, it seemed like they embraced this role of being leaders in the community as well. And Will, and again, some of your research, I read about things like these, annual parades that they would preside over, and the ways in which, Anna May in particular engaged in philanthropy to raise money for things like, famine relief and so forth, while at the same time kind of elevating the domestic plight or domestic conditions of people in Chinatowns. And so I wanted to ask a little bit about that notion of sort of, taking the responsibility to step in the foreground and pull others forward. And, is that something that was distinctive to these individuals, or something that pretty much because there were so few people, everybody was playing that sort of game?
Yeah, I mean, so the thing you're referring to, Jeff, is so after the Sino-Japanese War breaks out in 1937, right? There's an increased understanding amongst the American population at large that there's an issue. And so Chinese Americans, Chinatowns begin to throw what they call bowl of rice festivals, right? And these are kind of these like large fundraising festivals that are meant to kind of fundraise money to help war refugees in China. And Anna May Wong takes a very big part in the ones in Los Angeles. And it's interesting, because I did interviews with folks that were young people back then, and I encountered two people that that remember very, very fondly getting to work the Anna May Wong booth, right? Anna May Wong had a booth in Chinatown where she was signing autographs. And they, these are two young kids, like probably like 10, 12, that are like, hey, come and get your autograph of Anna May Wong, right? And so they had the most wonderful memories of just like kind of being in proximity to her. And so it was incredible that she was able to kind of use her fame in that way to kind of help the community. But what's interesting is when you look at these festivals over a long period of time, when the war first breaks out, the festivals are very much the kind of like product of local Chinese Americans, right? They're the CCB, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, is running them. The youth are in control, the Chinese American youth orgs are kind of in control of like most of the booths. So most of the money is staying kind of internal and then being sent back to China. Right before the start of World War, or right before the U.S. entry into World War II, so 1940, these things have become nationalized, and so Hollywood studios take over. Anna May Wong, when the first one had a booth, now is like riding in this car like down the middle of the street with like all of these other like celebrities, and like the Chinese Americans have by that point lost all control over like their own representations. And so it's interesting to see how someone like Anna May Wong can go from being is there at the grassroots 3 years earlier, and then 3 years later really has become more of this she has less control of her own representation by that point. So it was a negotiation period for sure.
Wow, fascinating. One thing that's kind of interesting, I think, about background extras, about James Wong Howe, and about Tyrus Wong, is that they're all operating behind the scenes, right? They don't have to be the face. Oh, well, I mean, the extras do, but nobody cares. They're anonymous essentially. But especially somebody who's an artist and who doesn't have to manifest as anything other than the imagery they're creating. Well, especially in the nascent world of like animation, for instance, I was surprised to see that there were more than a few Asian Americans who, in the very earliest days of animation, were operating in the background. And I wanted to ask a little bit about that. This whole notion that maybe there's almost like a protective shell that being allowed to be anonymous provided for Tyrus that was a little harder for people who had to be physically present and visible. Uh, Karen, if you could share a little about that.
Yeah. I mean, this is like a recurring theme in my book, which really explores the significance of commercial art as a choice, as an intentional choice. And so Tyrus's career starts in fine art, and it as a result of going to Disney and going to Warner Brothers, it eventually sort of settles around commercial art. And of course, the Christmas cards, which is the venue in which he had the greatest fame in his own lifetime, is the paradigm of commercial art. It's like mass-produced ephemera that everyone sees, but is not seen as like fine art, right? But for someone like Tyrus, and also James Wong Howe is another case, is like you're saying, someone behind the scenes, right, who is able to reach the upper echelons of Hollywood because his race matters less than his technical expertise. And so for Tyrus, I think commercial art, a lot of times commercial art is a place where it's good for artists because their race isn't known. They're not expected to be doing one thing versus another. He's actually, in the case of Tyrus, able to smuggle a kind of Orientalism into his art because that's like what everyone loves. Like that's what's so fascinating about the Christmas cards is he's painting like Christmas trees and children in pajamas and presents and angels with not only with Chinese brushwork, but sometimes with Asian features. So commercial art allows anonymity, but it also allows a kind of visibility, right? It's a kind of Trojan horse, and it also allows reception as well that can often be more subject to gatekeeping, as Anna May Wong finds devastatingly a number of times. And so I think absolutely things, animation, commercial art, anything behind the camera, in the case of James Wong Howe, allows you a degree of influence and legacy that maybe is appealing to some people.
I think that the notion of keeping the foreign-looking folks working in the background also is something that the studios themselves, or kind of the larger institutions, we're more than happy to do. We'll extract your labor, but we don't necessarily have to actually put you out front. But something you said I thought was really interesting in that part of what made Tyrus's work so gorgeous and different was that his initial training wasn't calligraphy, wasn't brush painting, right? To your point, in part because his parents couldn't afford to initially send him to traditional art schools. And as a result, the very thing that made him different, that in a way he was excluded from or by, was also a bit of a superpower. It made what he created just distinctive in a way that people couldn't, if they didn't know what brush painting was, really parse and therefore special. James Wong Howe was also similar because the thing he was most known for out of the many innovations that made his cinematography career so special is that he figured out a way to shoot light-eyed people with blue or gray eyes, and have those eyes show up. And it involved kind of putting a black scrim around the lens and so forth. But he was conscious of that in part because, as somebody who was outside of that system in a way, as a Chinese man with dark hair and dark eyes, it was something that he was more hyper conscious of perhaps. And as a result, he, with this innovation, ended up being like the cinematographer of choice for a lot of the biggest starlets who were blonde and blue-eyed, etc. So in a way, it's like kind of turning the thing that makes you different, the thing that makes you an outsider, into a thing that makes you special and therefore wanted. I mean, that was also true of Anna May Wong, although again, she had to do it with herself, with her body. And I want to just ask you a little bit about that, Katie, this whole notion of outsider insider status and how Anna May kind of played with that boundary a lot.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think in all of these cases, being Chinese could be an asset, right? I mean, her Chineseness is what made her unique in Hollywood. There was nobody else like her. Of course, then that pigeonholed her in certain types of roles. You know, the exotic types, China doll or dragon lady. But she understood this innately, that to play up certain aspects of her Chinese identity was good for her celebrity, and in a way also introducing people to Chinese culture. I mean, very similar to what Will was talking about when we were talking about shopkeepers and business owners being able to control the way in which their culture is represented. I mean, Anna May Wong was doing that as well. I mean, the things that she did with her fashion, she always tried to have some type of Asian element in her dress, whether it was certain flowers or embroidery or silk. She also very often had her name, her Chinese name, embroidered onto her clothing or onto her hat or her handbags. That was a very distinctive thing. She manicured her nails to these long, pointy fingernails, which is kind of partially probably where you get the dragon lady with the long nails from. I mean, but that was her kind of coming up with a persona. I mean, it wasn't necessarily 100% authentic. Actually, one of the things that always comes up in my mind, if any of you are familiar with Corky Lee, rest in peace, Corky, the Asian American photographer, one of the things he used to say was, "I'm a 100% authentic fake," as a Chinese American, right? And I think that really applies in her case. I mean, she's never been to China, so she's like kind of other people, creating her own identity that is a mix of these two things. And she was very successful at doing that. The only issue is, right, we're talking about visibility. And for her, I mean, she had to be visible. She's in front of the camera, she's a celebrity. So her visibility is powerful. I mean, it means so much to other Asian Americans to be represented, but at the same time, the types of parts that she's playing, you know, which in her early career, she didn't have a lot of control over, very scantily clad, you know, Mongol slave, or you know, in The Toll of the Sea, she's the girl who falls in love with the white man, and then he abandons her and she's pregnant and gives up her child to him. And, you know, so these kind of sordid tales that don't put Asians and Asian Americans in the best light. You know, that's something that when she goes to China, people are highly critical of her. They feel like she needs to stay and study their culture, that she needs to learn a thing or two. And so there's a lot of kind of fraught relationships she has, both with Americans, with Chinese Americans. I mean, I think, again, going back to some of those efforts that she made during the war to support China Relief, to support the refugees, you see her as a figurehead, and she's bringing all these people together and bringing money in. But at the same time, there are other things going on behind the scenes when, you know, Sung Mei Ling comes, you know, and does her great, huge lecture tour throughout the United States to garner support for China. She ends the tour at the Hollywood Bowl, and Anna May Wong is not invited. All of these other Hollywood stars are invited, but not Anna May Wong, despite all of her efforts. So there's kind of all these things going on. I mean, another great story, going back to some of the people that Will had interviewed, talking about their fond memories of Anna May Wong, because of Will, I listened to some of those oral histories. One of the men, well, he was a young man at the time, he said actually that Anna May Wong's autograph booth, no one was visiting it, and he couldn't believe it. You know, why is you got this huge Chinese American star and no one was, you know, visiting? So he and his friends started, you know, hey, everyone, come get your autograph. And that, to me, you know, I don't know if this is that to me just kind of said that there was a kind of distance that she also felt or experienced from her own community, right? Because either she was too famous, or they didn't approve of her choices in life, or they didn't approve of the types of representations that she made on screen. So that itself also was a difficulty that she experienced in her life.
I mean, even though
Can I build on that just real quick?
Yeah, sure.
One thing I think is really interesting, right, just on this, is that I do, you know, and Katie, you probably know this better than I do, but it seems like her reception, and Anna May Wong's reception in China, was resoundingly negative, right? Whereas I feel like people in LA Chinatown, at least, had a much more complex kind of understanding of the things that she had to negotiate. Like the interviews that I've seen about her, oftentimes people are very explicit about the fact that, you know, maybe some of them are like, oh, we disliked some of the roles, but then they say something in the same sentence where it's like, oh, but we understood that, you know, she was, not in these exact words, but she had to negotiate the kind of system that she was under, right? And I feel like because so many Chinese Americans in LA were in the movie industry, they could see the kind of complexity of Anna May Wong's position and the way in which she navigated this, to an extent that probably folks in China did not. Because my understanding is when she went to China, people were just like resoundingly like they didn't like her representations.
Well, I mean, I think I think it was also kind of complicated because she was, I mean, to her own surprise, when she arrives in Shanghai in 1936, there are mobs of people waiting to see her. And she thought no one would even know who she was. And of course, that wasn't the case. So many people were very, very excited to meet her and to, just, I guess, touch a celebrity essentially. And the nationalist government, had this long, big banquet for her, which was also kind of a, criticism session where they went on and ranted about like all the things that she did wrong. So there was like kind of a backhanded respect for her because clearly, she's important. You can't ignore her, right? Because whether you like it or not, and it's absurd to think this, but she did represent Chinese and China everywhere, right? Like, I mean, it's crazy to think that one person could represent an entire country and culture, but that really was the case for her. And so I guess, I mean, maybe the Chinese in general didn't like her, but they felt like that she was useful. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there were some people who genuinely loved her and were interested in her, as everyone is in celebrities at some point. But I think even Chinese Americans in Los Angeles might be one thing. Like they might have understood innately because they've been part of the Hollywood movie business. But I think later generations were not as kind to Anna May Wong as well, right? In the 60s, I mean, and even today, I still see comments sometimes like, why are we still talking about Anna May Wong? She's the reason that we have all these terrible stereotypes about Asian women. So her visibility is, it's two sides of the coin, right? You can either be loved and admired, or your hyper visibility makes you the target, the scapegoat.
I'm gonna just jump in and say one more thing. I think what your point is, it's so interesting, right? Because I feel like that's the same representation that Chinatown itself gets, right? I feel like that so often what happens is that people, Chinese Americans or Asian Americans today, look back at this period ahistorically, right? And they don't understand, we opened up with this question about exclusion. They don't understand the extent to which Chinese exclusion infiltrated every single aspect of Chinese American life, right? It wasn't just the fact that you couldn't leave the country, right? It kept you from doing jobs outside of Chinatown. It kept you from, there's all of these interviews of people who come out of US, there's a whole group of Chinese Americans that went through USC. They graduate in the early 30s and they can't find any work, right? They've got bachelor's degrees and now they're like, oh, what do I do? Either I have to go back to China or I've got to go back to Chinatown and work in a laundry or a restaurant, right? And so I feel like oftentimes post 65 Chinese America, Asia America looks back on this period forgetting how profoundly the Exclusion Act affected Anna May Wong, affected the lives of Chinese Americans, and that people were negotiating these profoundly racist laws in the best ways that they could.
Right. And that the ways in which they did that were subversive. I mean, it was knowingly, they were doing these things knowingly, and it was subversive in its own way. Yes, Karen.
I just want to bring in Karen. Yeah.
What Will and Katie were saying, that I think another thing that sort of supplements what Katie is saying about sort of like the burdens of the pioneer and the ways in which, like, when you're the only person, like, you're never really going to be understood because there's no precedent, no context, or no framework. Another sort of important thing to understand, and I'm sure Katie can speak more about this than I can, to understanding Anna May Wong, is how different her legacy has been in Europe, where she was immediately accepted, and like the sort of the historical record and the critical reception of her has always been one that's sort of like admiring, and maybe there's a lot of Orientalism that's going on there as well. But to Will's point, precisely because Europe is not shaped in the same exclusion history, the same exclusion and racial history of America, that there's not the same sort of prejudices and assumptions and expectations surrounding Anna May, in European film and in European reception of her, as there was, between the US and China.
There were different misperceptions, but yes, Europe has its own unique legacy of relationship with, subaltern countries and so forth. I did want to ask along those lines, though, to you, Karen, a bit more about Tyrus and his legacy, right? And maybe that's kind of the question I want to leave each of you guys with as well, about the legacy each of these individuals had for our present. I've seen, Tyrus's mural in Chinatown. it is gorgeous, and I did not know that Tyrus Wong had painted it for many, many years, but it is just absolutely this dynamic work that both takes some of the elements that we would consider to be kind of, exotic or oriental. It's a dragon, right? And yet it brings such a kind of a glorious sense of verve and color and movement to it that this is not just somebody who is a muralist for hire. This is somebody who's this is a masterpiece created by a master. And so in terms of that legacy of Tyrus's work, though he was a commercial artist, he has since been received as a fine artist. He is somebody who's collected. He's somebody who's celebrated in that way. I wanted to ask about that transition for you and what you think, other than being the guy who helped kill Bambi's mom, what Tyrus's legacy is for the present.
Well, so first of all, he started as a fine artist and then he shifted. And so the murals actually before, well, the mural sort of in the middle, but I think that, one of the things that I really wanted to do with the book was sort of, I think anybody who gets to know Tyrus, and I was not as lucky as Will to meet Tyrus when he was living, but, I've lived with Tyrus like in my mind and in my heart for like years now. Anyone who gets to know Tyrus, like, there's the incredible story of his art and his life. And the thing about the commercial art and the fine art is that you're always experiencing it. You can go to LA and see the mural, like Jeff is saying. You can also pick it up at the Phoenix Bakery, where it's on all of the bakery boxes, right? And anybody who's seen Bambi, has seen Tyrus's work, even if they didn't know it. And so that's the sort of important legacy of this person who really shaped American visual culture profoundly throughout the 20th century. But one of the things that I really wanted to do with the book was, to tell the story of his life, because I think that that's what you really walk away with, is like his greatest work of art is the way he lived his life, to have lived through exclusion, to live through internment and watch so many of his artist friends have their lives and their careers permanently disruptive because of internment, right? To go on through civil rights. And, to live through 2011 or September 11th and see another American crisis about race and immigration, right? And then, he died in 2016. And, when there was a lot of sort of anti-immigrant vitriol going on during that time. And so, I think that Tyrus's legacy is, of course, the fact that he shaped American visual culture in multiple ways, in ways that are highly visible and ones that are, not so conscious, but I think really just sort of a model of grace and dignity and humility and humor.
He also lived to 106 years old, which means one of his legacies was basically outliving all of his enemies, detractors, and critics. He's just sort of like, that's something which many of us might be sort of thinking of as an unlikely but aspirational thing. But I wanted to actually turn that question next to Will, and then Katie, you can close us out, and we'll turn to questions from the audience. Will, what would you say is the legacy of these unnamed and mostly unknown thousands of extras who operated out of Chinatown and appeared on screen in this era?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that this is really some of the first like Chinese American, Asian American representation, right? And I think that we as a Asian American community folks that are interested in Asian American cinematic representation should go back and take a look at some of these early films. One of the things that I write about in the book is so when The Good Earth comes out, I just talked about how it's all the actors are whiteface and yellow, or white actors in yellowface. But what happens in the Chinese American community is that one of the first English language publications, Chinese Digest, puts out a whole issue devoted to The Good Earth, right? And in this issue, they highlight all of the stories of the background extras and the bit players, right? There's even a picture of all the bit players like lined up. So I don't know if it's a Hollywood premiere or something like that, with none of the quote stars, right, are in this image. And it's like, and they've got all their names below it. It's like the Chinese American community embraced this as their crazy rich Asians, right? They were able to take kind of the scraps that Hollywood left them and transform it into something that for them was very empowering, right? So I would say that, while these films are, sometimes you if you watch them and you see and you're only focusing on the folks in the foreground, you're missing how important these films were to Asian American audiences, to Chinese American audiences, by not looking at the people in the background, because that's who they were looking at, right? They were looking at the bit players, they were looking at the background extras, and they're worth revisiting just because of that kind of significant aspect of their history.
Painting in the backgrounds of our narratives is so important. And I will say, Katie, you mentioned Corky Lee, friend, collaborator of mine for many years. One of the things that he was most proud of was actually staging or restaging a photograph of the joining of the Intercontinental Railroads, actually putting the descendants of Chinese workers in the foreground, like, where they've been excluded from that picture in the past. And that brings us to Anna May Wong and her legacy. I mean, she's literally on her money now. So she's spendable. But beyond that, she's also somebody I think who's having more than a moment. People have rediscovered her, are celebrating her aspirationally. But what would you say in kind of that bigger expanse of, where we are in Hollywood, that Anna May Wong has had her legacy felt?
So one of the things that I tried to do in my book was really reframe the narrative around her career and her life. If you just Google her and kind of look at the Wikipedia page, it's up. Her life really gets characterized as like, what a tragedy. Like all of these racist things happened to her, which is true. She didn't get the lead role in The Good Earth, and then the end. Too bad. Like she could have had this incredible career. But the whole my version of the story is actually she did have an incredible career. And let's look at all of the crazy milestones that she crossed off the list as one person who died when she was 56, but worked for 4 decades, so worked for most of her life. And actually, a lot of those milestones came after The Good Earth, which people forget because they're so focused on this disappointment. But she comes back from her trip to China and makes a series of films with Paramount that are akin to the Charlie Chan detective series. She says, why can't I play a Chinese American hero who, busts crimes and does all of these good deeds? And, she creates Daughter of Shanghai in 1937 with Philip Ahn, Korean American actor. They're playing the two leads. He's actually playing an FBI agent, several decades before there was an actual Asian American person working in the FBI. And together, they're the heroes of the story. They end up romantically with their own happy ending. And all of the villains of the film are played by white actors. She totally flipped the script with that film in 1937. And I don't know if anyone really noticed it. But that type of thing is what she did like all throughout her career. I mean, she went on in the 1950s to become the first Asian American to lead a television series with the Gallery of Madame Liu Song, which was her own kind of concoction of a art gallery lady who solves international art crimes. I mean, the list kind of just goes on and on. So I really hope that people focus on all the triumphs of her career. But the other important legacy that I think she's left us is understanding that people like her and Tyrus and James Wong Howe and Setsu Hayakawa and many of the extras that are spoken about in Will's book, all of these Asian Americans, Chinese Americans were in Hollywood at the very beginning. And it's only now that we're seeing the floodgates start to open just a little bit. We're just starting to see a beginning of like what's really possible with Asian American storytelling. And to see, someone like Michelle Yeoh win the Best Actress Award at the Academy Awards, the 95th Academy Awards. It took more than 100 years to get to that point. And why is that? So to me, the lesson is really, we can't stop pushing. Like progress doesn't happen on its own, because if it did, then Anna May Wong would have won an Oscar, back in her day, and she didn't. So we have to keep working towards what we ultimately want, which is to be, to be able to show the complete spectrum of human experience, to show that we can experience all of these things just as any other type of character in a mainstream American film. So yeah, so that's where I will leave things.
A fantastic way of leading things, well spoken, and I think a great frame for what we're all trying to say here on this conversation. I'd love to open it up for questions. I don't know if I have access to the Q&A function, so it might need to be, Katie, if you have access to it, you taking
Let's
oh,
see.
actually it's over here. Oh, I think we don't have any questions yet. But
Okay, yeah, I'm not seeing any either.
if anybody does have questions and wants to pop them into, well, the chat, I suppose, or otherwise. And while that's happening, there are certainly more questions that I have.
I also just want to say, like, one of the things, I can't speak for Katie and Will, but I think for me, it's super fun for us to be on this and have this conversation together, not only because our subjects are, the same period, the same setting, right? And the same industry, but like they all knew each other. Right. I mean, like Anna Mae and Tyrus were very good friends, from the mid 30s, like, in the Dragon's Den restaurant in Chinatown, where Tyrus is a significant figure, the extras were all coming in and out. Anna Mae hosted a prominent dinner there. Like, someone like Tyrus, who's always behind the scenes, is sort of going back and forth equally between above the line talent and, everybody that is sort of seen as crew or, extras as well. And so, we're having a dialogue with each other, not just because we have shared research interests, but because our subjects were like interacting with each other as well.
I think that that notion of the sort of thriving but invisible society around Chinese Hollywood, Chinese American Hollywood, as it were, is something that's super fascinating. And if you have not already subscribed to Half Caste Woman, it's a little, a little ad for Katie's newsletter. You should, because a lot of the conversation around the hidden gems of this golden era, the gold, literally, in this golden era, is stuff that Katie writes about and talks about regularly in that newsletter. It looks like, do we have one question in now?
Yeah,
here?
there's one from
Oh,
Evelyn.
a couple coming in. All right. Let's jump into this first one. With people of color now, and this is from Evelyn Quo, with people of color now in positions of power in universities, government, law enforcement, etc., squashing student protests, do you feel like focusing on representation is potentially harmful? And in what ways is it still important?
Can I say something on this? It's a wonderful question.
Please. Yeah.
No, I think that what happens often is, and this happens quite a lot recently, right? Is that oftentimes we get wrapped up in issues of representation without realizing the ways in which those representations both affect the lives of people that are outside in the world, outside, off the screen, but also the ways in which, right, in the case of my book, right, the representations also are deeply linked to things like labor and kind of like working conditions, right? And so I think that to the extent nowadays that if you focus only on representation, right, like there is a world in which we could say like, oh, yippee, we've got Shang-Chi and we've got, you've got all of these representations and Disney's making all of these movies that have Asian Americans in them. Isn't that a wonderful thing? It's important to kind of do that with a caveat that we understand that those representations are not the end all be all of everything, right? So while they are certainly important, they are only kind of like one aspect of a larger kind of like struggle, if you will, right? If you're thinking about the goal when people are kind of often arguing about representations is they care about Hollywood or they care about film or they care about media representations because they think that they matter in terms of seeing themselves, but they want to see themselves because they want a more just and equitable world. And so if we only focus on representations, it's a problem. But if we kind of look at representations as one aspect of a kind of a larger kind of picture, I think that it's not necessarily a problem, right? If all we focus on representations, it's a problem.
I mean, so this actually hits directly what I write about a lot, which is this larger notion that representation not only shouldn't be seen in a vacuum, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. That a lot of what we've been talking about here is that the same people who are fighting to have us show up on screen, we're connected to communities, we're actively involved in them, and we're playing roles both as leaders of those communities and as connectors of those communities to places of power, to places where their stories could be told and their issues and needs could be magnified. And when we think about things like even the beginnings of the Asian American movement, there's a reason why the Asian American studies movement, why Asian American studies was the center of that movement. There's a reason why the very first things that Asian American activists did was create media, create newspapers and magazines. There's a reason why East West Players was actually founded before there was actually the term Asian American, right? Because people recognized that without platforms on which we can actually tell messages that are inherently politicized, because by defining them as Asian American, by claiming space for them, we are actually saying that our voice in all ways matter, not just in entertainment, but in spaces like when we are protesting, in spaces like when we're educating others, in spaces like when we're demanding that change occurs in the world around us. And I fully agree that there's sometimes a sense in which people talk about representation as if all we need to do is just like show up on screen and walk away. But at the same time, if we don't do that work of changing narratives by ensuring that we, again, are not just presented and represented, but that we have agency to shape those narratives and tell stories that uplift the issues we're talking about, we're as absent as if we are not addressing the change that has to happen in the streets. Sorry, it's one of those things where I think that there is a tendency to call people out for speaking about certain things, not other things, within the context of our greater Asian American, or greater, sort of social justice struggle. And the reality is, we should be lifting all parts of all parts of our society together. Anyway, did somebody else have something to say on that?
I was just going to add that, I mean, living through the pandemic, I mean, we've also seen just how important and how damaging it can be to have, someone like an authority, like a president, say, the China flu, the Kung flu, that alone, I mean, whether that's an issue of representation or just, outright racism, I mean, we have to be able to combat those types of stereotypes, images, and how can we do that? I mean, soft power, America is like the most powerful country in the world because of soft power, right? We're able to export our culture. But if Asian Americans aren't part of that, what's our relationship even inside that culture and that country? I mean, so visibility, I mean, as we've talked about, can be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's also and I would say an outgrowth of just us being able to speak up for ourselves, to tell our own stories. I mean, and back to what you said, Jeff, I mean, I think who tells the story is really important. And that's really what all of, I think, our books are talking about. So of course it's not the be all end all, like, Hollywood films to some extent. Yeah, sometimes they're frivolous and silly, and they're just entertainment. But they can be a lot more than that too.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with everything that Katie and Will are saying. And remember, we've said this in different ways many times already, but for ethnic Asians, representation is particularly charged because exclusion made us invisible in a way that other racial representation in the US was not.
I think about this a lot when we kind of flip the script a little bit and talk not about just, what it means to be Asian American and visible, as it were, but speak the language of solidarity, right? How do we actually find ways for, us to elevate Asian American voices, not just for ourselves, but for everybody around us, and how that happens in both directions. Last night, I actually interviewed a woman named Erica. This is completely off topic, but bear with me. Who was one of the founders. She grew up in the Nation of Islam. She's African American. Her mom was like an OG activist in New York City. Kind of brought her to protests, trained her, essentially in street activism and the need for community organizing. And she, as an adult, went on to college, became an anthropologist, but also firmly kept these values of the need to actually make change by organizing. And then she became this gigantic K-pop fan, like specifically BTS. She both loved the music, but also the values they represented. And as part of ARMY, not only did she plug into this sort of global mass of persons who were aligned around kind of sharing their love and passion for this media object, right? But when the opportunity availed itself to kind of use that power and direct it. She and a kind of a task force of diverse people from around the world and across different racial groups ended up organizing a kind of loose organization called One in an Army, right? Which ended up raising $1 million for Black Lives Matter, and has since turned the power of this sort of distributed literal army of fans towards raising millions of dollars for other causes, from trans justice to famine relief to environmental justice, deliberately moving from country to country and cause to cause with every single project they do. And again, it may seem like, oh, well, K-pop stands, what do they mean, right? But anytime you actually have collective action like that, collective action that is most easily mobilized in many ways by using the amplifying powers of entertainment, right? To pull people together, you have the opportunity to make really significant change wherever you turn. And I would argue that in this day and age, if we saw these figures out there, I have no doubt that they would be doing much the same, taking advantage of their spaces and their platforms to make that kind of radical change.
I want to add one story from my book, which kind of ties in here. So I mentioned about the Good Earth, right? So when they're casting the Good Earth in Los Angeles, right, they're seeking 1,000 extras in a community of 3,000. And the Chinese, and by this point, Central Casting had been founded. And Central Casting was an organization that was meant to provide better working conditions for all extras. But Chinese Americans had found themselves cast out of Central Casting. There was actually a black wing, African American wing of Central Casting, but Chinese Americans found themselves outside of it. And so what they ended up doing, because there was such a demand during this period for extras, is they ended up organizing together. They petitioned some of the most high-profile kind of performers, petitioned the Chinese consulate to kind of advocate with the Hollywood studios, and they were able to get themselves better working conditions and better pay as a result of this kind of like need for more extras, right? And you were like, well, who cares? This is just extras in the 1930s. But we have to remember that the 1930s was also the height of the Depression, right? And so Chinese American extra work in Los Angeles was profoundly important for people just surviving, because so many people found themselves unable to access U.S. government assistance for multiple reasons, right? And so they use this type of like representational issue to bring about actual structural change in their actual working conditions in Los Angeles, which then in turn kind of helps, kind of lift up whole segments of the community in terms of this very, very difficult time of kind of like economic, despair. And so this was certainly just one example of ways in which we can kind of see the link between kind of representations and organizing and kind of structural change in LA, at least.
Fantastic. Any more questions? I'm sure we can continue this conversation and so on and so forth. I do want to encourage you guys to actually take a look at the books. Will's, I think you said Winter's
May 14th, coming up, just
May 14th.
one week today, 1 week away.
And I know Katie has shared some links to pay for to buy those, pay for them. Oh, we have another question. So this is kind of an interesting question, a little hypothetical, but bringing up the connection between pop culture and contemporary art, would you have a guess as to what kinds of films or TV shows would be on the top of Anime Wong's and Tyrus Wong's watch lists today?
That is a great question. And also, I feel like you have to be really up on pop culture right now. What would Anime Wong? I mean, honestly, I think she'd be so excited just to see everything that's going on right now. I mean, to see something like Crazy Rich Asians, of course.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, again, an all Asian cast, but also it's an Asian love story, right? That was something that was often denied her. I don't know. There's so many projects. I mean, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I mean, I've actually started using AI art to like reimagine Anime Wong in films that she never would have been in. So I actually created one that's of her
Starring
as
Anime.
Michelle. Well,
Yeah.
it's everything everywhere all at once, but it's instead of Michelle Yeoh, it's Anime.
But don't you think, Katie, there'd be a little bit of bitterness too? Like, oh, they're so lucky because they were just born later. Like, and in my book, I talk about how Tyrus would always say of Anime that she was born ahead of her time. And I can't help but think, I mean, I think even for Michelle Yeoh, who's just, Michelle Yeoh has had so many moments of like thresholds in her career.
Right.
And so, people think like, oh, she's like, she's such a pioneer and a groundbreaker, and she is, but like it's after like decades of like pushing against the ceiling, for so many times. And so I just, of course she would be super happy, but I just also wonder if she, because she would have had this historical memory of working in the industry in so many different eras, right? I mean, she was there, the studios, and this is important in my book, the studios gave people opportunities that are not necessarily possible in the post-studio era as well. So, I mean, there's so many nuances, right? About
I'm sure I'm sure the heartache of not being able to be in the good earth and other things that happen in her career would never go away, right? That there's nothing that will ever resolve that. But I do think that in a way, I mean, if I were her, I would see everything that's happening now as my legacy. Yeah, I did this. Like I was there first and I made it possible for all of you. And I think a lot of people in Hollywood do feel that way. I mean, one of the ways that I try to explain, like, why is we're experiencing this great revival of her memory, right? And I think, part of it, I think, probably has to do with the fact that we do have all these other Asian American stories now out in the world, and people are beginning to wonder, what came before this, right? Or what are our roots? Like, where did this all start? And people are looking backwards to her.
The question makes me think a little bit about James Hong, right? Who
I was going to mention James.
Who is 90 some odd years old right now, right? And literally, like he's one of the founders of East West Players. Like he has actually seen all of this, and it's interesting to see like how much work he's getting now, right? Like there's like he's probably, he's probably having the biggest like surge of work in his career in his late 90s because of this kind of like moment. And I'm curious, like, just to point out that there are people who are, maybe he's a little younger than their generation, but of that era, who lived through that era, who are still around today and working.
So I was thinking of James. I'm for what it's worth, I'm actually talking with his family right now about working with him on his memoir. But I was thinking of him because in talking with him, he does actually exemplify that whole, celebration of how far we've come. Literally, that was his famous, look at us now, right? Statement that he made at the Golden Globes when Everything Ever All at Once won that ensemble award. While also, yes, feeling a little bit like people today don't know how hard the road was and need to know in order to actually be conscious of the choices that they're making and frankly respectful of the ground as it was laid and built by those people who came earlier. I do think that Anime Wong, if she had not had the health issues that came in many cases from the stresses and the sort of temptations of Hollywood, that like others in her orbit, like Tyrus Wong, might well have lived into her centenarian years. We have quite a few very old and very revered people in that generation of, of Asian Hollywood now. Lisa Liu, who's almost 100, was still acting in Crazy Rich Asians, right? Tsai Chin, I think she's almost 100 as well. Still out there. She starred in Lucky Grandma just a few years ago, which is kind of like an action movie. It was like amazing. So I'd like to believe that Anime Wong, if she had the opportunity to, would have found her way into roles like that. I feel the same way about Bruce Lee as well, that if he had lived beyond his 30 odd years, he too would have found a place as a grand master, kind of one of the beloved senior people in our communities. And it looks like we have another question, which let's actually ask this question, talk it through, and then maybe give people a few minutes more out on their day. So this is kind of a little bit of a follow-up to the earlier question from Evelyn. So what advice would you each give young artists who are constantly trying to make modern and more radical Chinese American representations. What are some of the key lessons we should take away from the people we wrote about, from Anna May Wong, from Chinese extras, from Tyrus Wong, and yeah, from people like James Wong Hao, especially given the increasing xenophobia and tensions that we're seeing with China as magnified by politicians today. Let's start actually with you, Will.
I mean, I would say that like, and this is building on, I kind of think the point from the earlier question, is that there is a danger today that, and we see, you know, Disney and some other of the major studios do this all the time, in which like diversity gets kind of extracted from history and from kind of power and from structures, and it becomes this type of thing that's just celebrated in a way to profit large corporations, which is quite different. You know, Jeff, you mentioned earlier on like the work of, let's say, the kind of early, you know, group of Asian American studies kind of folks that are coming and making documentaries, let's say in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s, right? In which like Asian American radical artists are trying to really use documentary filmmaking as a form to kind of uplift stories of people that have been disempowered. And I think that as long as, you know, artists are kind of wary of the fact that diversity can be, at this moment in time, can be co-opted when it's kind of divorced from history and social structures, you know, as long as you're kind of thinking it through kind of the ways in which representation is always linked to other things in society, and kind of rooting representation within histories of you know, the histories that acknowledge the kind of both racism plus all the kind of triumphs of Asian American communities, you're probably going in the right place.
Amazing. Katie.
Yeah, I mean, I think my advice would be, I guess, which may seem overly simple, but just to write what feels true to you, stories that you care about, and not worry that, oh well, it's a mainstream white audience isn't going to like it. I think you just have to create the best story that you can and find a home for it. I mean, one of the things, and actually I should have used this as my answer for the previous question about like what would I want to see Anna May Wong in, or what would she be proud of? I mean, I wrote about Beef with Stephen Yun and Ali Wong in one of my newsletters, and how I compared it to Daughter of Shanghai, in which Anna May Wong and Philip Bond are the leads. And so I think that one of the things that was so great about that show, that series, is that it's not meant to be an Asian American story. It's a story about road rage and these two people and their crazy, you know, connection in a way, and everything else, and this drama that they get, you know, consumed by. And then they happen to be Asian American, and most of the characters do too. But it's not set out to be. I mean, I think we're finally getting to that point where we can just tell stories. And yes, the characters can be Asian American, but we don't have to go through a whole like, oh, our heritage and, you know, these cultural identity crises and things like that. We can just tell stories, and the characters can happen to be Asian American. So yeah, so that's really my advice, is just to follow the stories that feel true and authentic to you, regardless of whether or not they're a representation narrative, and but they can still be. That is my point.
I do think that when you do that kind of casting right and that kind of creativity right, we have, you know, people behind the scenes. The writer is Asian American, you know, Sunny Lee, you know, most of the cast, not just the two leads, Ali Wong and Steve Yun, but most of the other people around them were also just incidentally Asian American. What you end up with is something where that Asian Americanness just sort of seeps into the storyline, right? And so there are all these like moments that feel like Easter eggs to us, but are eye-popping to people, or completely ignored by people who are outside of our communities. And I kind of love that. It's also, I think, the recipe, especially in an era of xenophobia, an era of in many cases xenophobia, for us to, I think, weave ourselves into this larger narrative instead of trying to kind of bring assimilation to the table, where we erase our differences, where we, you know, do our best to hide the fact that we come from places, spaces, and backgrounds that make us separate in some ways or distinctive. We simply say those things are normal. We normalize difference, and we normalize what's radical as well, because part of the problem, I think, that we're facing as a society is we're allowing the people to define things that are just, you know, normal as radical, and things that are radical as abhorrent, right? so we got to start pushing that window back. We got to start saying, it's not radical for people to actually be able to eat and live in houses. It's not radical for people to have free expression. It's not radical to not want people to be beaten by law enforcement. That's not radical, right? Black people living is not radical. So anyway, sorry to jump on the soapbox there.
Yeah,
Karen, why don't you take us home? Yeah.
well, I wanted to ask Evelyn, like, how does she define radical, right? Because, I want to end by sort of making the strong argument for commercial art. And, I tell my film students all the time, like, you could try to break into Hollywood, or I would go work in a place like Korea or Hong Kong, which is making stuff all the time, and you're going to work all the time, and that's how you really learn. And, commercial art, it allows you to do so many different things. Tyrus did so many things, and the historical record will save you. I think sometimes people don't understand. I mean, this is what we're finding out about Anna May Wong, Tyrus, and the Chinatown extras, right? Chinatowns across the world, as Will is saying, right? We don't understand them because they become unmoored by time, but then time changes again, and we re-understand them. And so whatever you do, what you want, and this is why art is so powerful, is it allows a kind of historical preservation. So whatever you do, radical or however you define radical, I think art is a transcendent medium by which to express yourself.
What a great place to end.
Well, I want to thank all of you guys for an incredible conversation and some incredible work. The books you've written, I haven't read yet all of them, but I plan to. And I look forward to seeing additional conversations and more work from you in the future. I will certainly be reaching out to you guys individually as I work on other things, such as this Golden Screen documentary, which I'm putting together. So thank you, and thank you to Stanford and the alumni group for pulling this together, and Katie for organizing.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for everyone who's here, and thanks for joining us all today.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Take care.
Bye, guys.